Good morning. We have another chapter that we're going to be reading from our Ancient Rome reader. We are almost at the end of our book. We have actually just one more chapter that we'll be doing next week, last week of school before the Christmas break and end of the semester. So today we're going to be reading about the decline of the Roman Empire. Decline kind of goes along with the spelling word we had, descend or descent, which means to go down. So the Roman Empire is falling and coming down. What that means is that what once was an empire that had control of areas all around the world. The Roman Empire spanned most of Europe plus Africa and some of Asia even. But it's starting to lose power for the reasons that we're going to see in our chapter today. So please read along with me. I've got the book posted in Bright Thinker so that you can read it as often as needed and refer back to. And I will show you how to get to there. I've done this with you all before, but it's good to have a little refresher. So in your student app, not in your to-do list, but if you go to History and click Ancient Rome Reader, that takes you to the book itself. So we can click on the link. And we'll be reading chapter 15 today. As you can see, that's the decline of the Roman Empire. The last chapter is called East and West. So we'll see what that is about next week. Oops. Do not want to print all of these 114 pages. Okay, so is this right? Yes, it is. Chapter 15, the decline of the Roman Empire. Now, Luciano, who's the student we've been hearing about in the last chapter as well, enjoyed taking part in class. Do you remember what he was doing? He had a special assignment. That's right. He was supposed to learn about Christians in ancient Rome, and he was supposed to teach about the Pox Romana. Do you remember what Pox Romana means? It's peace in ancient Rome. Okay, so it's a time of peace. Now, each day, the teacher gave him a special assignment. The next day, Luciano would tell the class what he had learned. Luciano thought about his latest assignment as he walked home from school. The teacher told him to read about the time after the Great Roman Peace. During that time, the empire began to decline. Do you all say decline? Decline means to grow weaker. So this empire is starting to go downhill, growing weaker and weaker. It had been conquering more and more areas of land, and now it's starting to shrink and grow weaker. Luciano wondered what had happened. As he walked, Luciano crossed a beautiful old stone bridge. He knew the ancient Romans built the bridge. Millions of people had used the bridge in the many years since then. Luciano was proud to be a Roman. When he got home, Luciano told his mother about his assignment. She was pleased. She wanted him to work hard and enjoy learning. Luciano sat down to read. His teacher said there had been big changes. Here is a photograph of what parts of Rome look like still today. This is a graceful Roman bridge, it says, that shows the city's glorious past. So even though we're learning about the decline of ancient Rome, there are still pieces of evidence, these buildings and bridges and roads that we could see today if we go to Rome to see why it was such a well-known empire, one of the greatest empires of all time in our world. So the next day, Luciano told the class how Rome changed. They just said, things are changing after the Pox Romana, or time of Roman peace. Let's see why. The honorable emperors of the Great Roman Peace were gone. For the next 50 years, most of the emperors faced many problems. For example, Rome suffered attacks from outsiders, civil war, and widespread illness. Okay, so let's review those, because that's a lot already. They had attacks from outsiders. We're going to find out more about these people soon. The barbarians, or Vikings, there were attacks from those people. We're going to hear more about the Vikings in a different history unit later. What else? Civil war. What's civil war? We had a civil war in our country, but there are also civil wars that happen in all sorts of countries around the world. It's when people within the same country are fighting against each other. It's really sad that that happens ever. Now, there was civil war within the empire. There was also widespread illness, like the pandemic happening right now. So there are all sorts of problems happening in the empire. Attacks from outsiders, civil war where they're fighting against each other, and illness, widespread, like the pandemic happening across the world for us right now. Now some emperors were too weak to solve these problems. Some people just ignored them or just couldn't do anything about them, so they didn't actually come up with solutions. Now others, such as Nero, ignored the people's needs. They looked after only themselves instead. So Nero is considered one of the worst, if not the worst, emperor in all of Roman history. He was one who is said to have just been playing a violin, I think it was, or you might remember better than me because I think it was in our last one. Actually, let me just look back in the book. Here it is. He's playing the lyre while Rome burned around him. And today we have the expression fiddling while Rome burns. That's right, it was two different instruments. So that was Nero. He was just letting things crumble around him rather than actually doing anything to help his people, the Romans. Okay, so this is what Luciano is telling his class. Now the teacher stood up. That is correct, Luciano. Many emperors were too weak or too selfish to serve the people well. And sadly, a lot of times if people get more power, the more they start to focus in on themselves rather than helping other people. It starts to go to their head. Now, they could not protect the provinces from attack. Protecting the provinces cost a lot of money. So the provinces are ones where it's outside of Rome itself, but it's still under Roman rule. So those provinces needed protection, but they couldn't protect them all because it cost too much money to send all of these Roman soldiers to protect them. Some corrupt emperors named greedy men to be generals in the army. Sometimes a general would kill the emperor. Then that general would become the new emperor. Now, someone who's corrupt has done something dishonest for personal gain. Would you say corrupt? Corrupt. Or corruption comes from this word too. So they're corrupt because they're doing things just for the sake of themselves to either have more money for themselves or more power. And so there are people within the government that were doing things in order to just make themselves better, including killing other people like the emperor so that they could take that position. Really terrible. Now, the new emperor, and this is sadly still the case in many countries, there's a lot of corruption that happens. But this was one of the most evident times in all of the Roman Empire history that there was a lot of corruption. When Rome was at its peak, had all of this land, all of this power, all of this money, and they're starting to lose it. And a lot of it has to do with these corrupt emperors. Now, the new emperors would then kill the family and friends of the old emperor. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 emperors in one year. Many powerful Romans were killed. For the old patrician families, life during this time could be very dangerous. Sometimes generals fought each other to take over the empire. The fighting destroyed many towns and farms. These civil wars also made trading difficult. In some places, people had very little food. People lost their jobs and their homes. Throughout the empire, people often lived in fear. So life was difficult for people who were in the upper class, who were more likely to have people be plotting against them, and also in the lower class, where a lot of them didn't have basic needs like food, because trading was in such a bad place. So the barbarians invade. This is what we're going to get to more in after Christmas break when we start learning about the Vikings. Now the teacher turned back to Luciano. What other changes happened during this time? Luciano said, The Roman army was also very different. There were many soldiers who no longer fought for the glory of Rome, like Cincinnatus did. Remember Cincinnatus? He went from a farmer to being like the general of his army. He was the temporary dictator at the time, just for the sake of really helping Rome. It wasn't for gaining power. He wanted to do it because he believed in protecting Rome because he was a Roman. But many of these soldiers came from Roman territories that were far from Rome itself. Okay, so imagine this. Imagine you're over here in Egypt. We know that Egypt was part of the Roman Empire, for example. So if you're an Egyptian and your country and your province has been taken over by Roman government, but you don't think of yourself as a Roman, you think of yourself as an Egyptian still. Are you going to really work hard to protect Rome? Probably not in the same way as what we were hearing about earlier, like with Cincinnatus, because you're not actually Roman. So you're still tied more to your homeland. So that's part of why this army is really changing. Now, the Romans called these outsiders barbarians. The Romans thought that the barbarians, which you can see here, pillaging the town, sadly, burning things, taking things from these buildings, they thought of them as uncivilized. That is, they did not know the rules of being a good citizen. So that's true. They didn't know that there are certain things you have to do in order to be a good citizen in a city or country. Still, the Romans needed them to serve in the Roman army. Very good, Luciano, the teacher said. Those were important changes in the Roman army. Many barbarians lived along the borders of the Roman Empire. Sometimes large armies of certain barbarian groups invaded Roman provinces. Sometimes Rome's armies had to fight barbarian invaders in a civil war at the same time. Many of Rome's best soldiers died fighting other Romans. So very sad. This should never have to happen, that there are just these uncivilized people breaking in and the army wasn't able to protect the cities because a lot of the soldiers were corrupt or they were fighting against other Romans because there's a civil war happening. And a lot of that has to do with the emperors being corrupt as well, because they're just worried about power. They're not worried about protecting their people. And that's what should be happening, is that they should be focused on protecting their people in making their country, the whole empire, a place that really is flourishing, where they are improving life for their people and continuing to grow and become really productive. So just nobody was really looking out for Rome as they should generally. I'm sure there were some good people within government, but very few that really stayed around. Like you saw 2 or 3 emperors sometimes within 1 year. Now, Rome's army grows weak. During this time, Rome's leaders treated the army badly as well. Soldiers sometimes had to wait for months or even years to get paid. That is not the way that you should treat somebody who's fighting for your country, to not pay them. So as you can see in this picture, it's showing barbarian attacks, lighting these buildings on fire, almost made the Roman Empire collapse. Once again, with this as well, if the soldiers were able to protect the city more, maybe that wouldn't have been the case. But there were so many other things going on that the soldiers weren't protecting Rome. Now, without money to buy food, the soldiers stole food to live. Many Roman soldiers lived by pillaging nearby farms and towns. So they didn't have food. You can't blame them. But it is sad. They were stealing things from neighboring farms and towns in order to have food to live off of and for their families. Now, over time, the Roman army became weak and dishonest, like the Roman government. Meanwhile, the barbarian armies grew stronger. So the Roman army started off as the most powerful in the world at the time of their height. And the barbarian armies, as we'll see more when we get to Vikings, are pretty small, and even if the individuals are weak, they don't work together as well as the Roman armies did. But the Roman army is declining and the barbarian army is getting stronger. They forced the Romans out of large areas in the western and northern parts of the empire. Eventually, the Roman Empire was ready to collapse or to fail or end suddenly, which means that a lot of these areas were not going to be under Roman rule anymore because of all of these problems. It makes it so much easier for barbarians or other people to take over Rome, just like Rome had been taking over other colonies and provinces that they were taking over. Now, the teacher continued. Then a strong, thoughtful man named Diocletian. Would you say Diocletian? Diocletian. He became emperor. He defeated a fierce barbarian army. Luciano, can you tell us what else Diocletian did? Luciano jumped to his feet. He spoke in a clear voice. Diocletian changed the whole Roman government, he said. He divided the empire into two parts with two emperors. One emperor governed the western part. Western is on this side. One emperor governed the western part. The other emperor governed the eastern part. Now, Diocletian named honest, hardworking men to rule the empire with him. After he ruled for 20 years, he did something no emperor had ever done before. He gave up his job. Sounds like Cincinnatus, doesn't he? So Diocletian had a great idea. The empire was really getting too big, so it does make more sense to have two emperors, similar to when Augustus Caesar and Mark Antony were trying to split their power. Mark Antony. So we've got the Western Empire now and the Eastern Empire. We're going to hear more about that in chapter 16 when we get into what those two empires are like. And one ends up being stronger than the other, as we'll see when we get into it. That is the last chapter that we are going to read next week. And then we're going to be finished with our Ancient Rome unit. It's been really fun to go through this with you guys. And hopefully you've just had your interest piqued, and maybe you've got other books or YouTube videos or other things to learn about ancient Rome that are you're already kind of getting a little bit of a hint of some things, and you can just go into more depth with more study. But that's all we have for today. There are some notes to take tomorrow. I will talk to you all later. Bye.